The wind outside the old mansion carried the whispers of trees and the soft rustling of leaves, while inside, the vast, quiet halls echoed with the creaks and groans of a house that had stood for too long. The girl sat up in her bed, her small frame swallowed by the oversized quilt that once belonged to her great-grandmother. It was her first night back home after a long week at school, and everything seemed still. But there was something odd. She hadn't noticed it at first, but as she moved to fluff her pillow, her hand brushed against a small piece of paper. Frowning, she lifted the pillow and found a folded note. Her name was scrawled on it in delicate, old-fashioned handwriting. Her heart quickened slightly as she unfolded it, eyes scanning the short message. "Tomorrow, you will forget your book." She blinked. A joke. Her mind immediately went to the maid who had been taking care of the house while her parents were away. Maybe it was an attempt to make her laugh. But the maid wasn't one for jokes, not in the time the girl had known her. The handwriting didn't match hers either. It was strange. Frowning again, she tucked the note into the drawer by her bed and pushed the thought away. It was probably just a mistake, something left over from the past, maybe an old scrap of paper from one of the rooms. She sighed, resting her head back against the pillow. Whatever it was, it didn't seem important enough to dwell on. She would ask the maid about it in the morning. Sleep came easily enough, but the note lingered in the back of her mind like a small, annoying itch she couldn't scratch. The next day was uneventful, or at least, it seemed so. She had breakfast in the large, echoing kitchen with the maid preparing her meal in silence, as always. The girl decided not to bring up the note just yet. Perhaps later. She spent the morning reading in her room, forgetting about the strange discovery. By afternoon, the sky outside darkened, the clouds gathering as if signaling the rain that was sure to come. The girl looked at the time and realized she needed to go downstairs. She grabbed her bag, pausing by her desk to pick up her book, and then she froze. It wasn't there. Panic rose in her chest. The book was always there, always in the same place. She had just seen it the night before. She searched frantically around the room, throwing aside pillows and blankets, checking under the bed and behind the desk. But the book was gone. Her mind raced back to the note. "Tomorrow, you will forget your book." No, it was just a coincidence, wasn't it? How could a note possibly predict something so specific? Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. She hurried downstairs and asked the maid, "Did you see my book? I can't find it." The maid, who was washing dishes, shook her head. "No, dear, I haven't touched anything in your room." The girl bit her lip, trying to push away the unease that was crawling up her spine. "Thanks," she murmured, turning away. As she climbed the stairs back to her room, her mind swirled with confusion. The note had been right, but how? And who had left it? The door to her room creaked as she opened it slowly, her eyes immediately falling on the bed. A new piece of paper peeked out from under the pillow. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the folded note beneath her pillow. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the paper. She unfolded it slowly, the familiar, elegant handwriting making her heart race. "Tonight, you will hear a knock on your window." She stood there, frozen, staring at the words. Her room was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could knock on her window without a ladder, and even then, who would? The feeling of unease grew stronger, twisting in her stomach. She shoved the note into the drawer with the first one and sat on her bed, trying to convince herself that it was all some kind of bizarre prank. The day dragged on. She went about her routine, though she found it harder to focus. At lunch, she barely touched her food, her mind racing. Could someone really be playing a trick on her? But who? And why? The maid noticed her distraction. "Is something on your mind?" she asked softly, her voice neutral. The girl shook her head quickly. "No, it's nothing," she said, forcing a smile. But the maid's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as though she knew there was more to the story. The girl excused herself and went back to her room, her heart heavy with unanswered questions. As night began to fall, the house grew quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds. She couldn't shake the feeling of dread building inside her as she got ready for bed. The note's prediction echoed in her mind. Tonight, you will hear a knock on your window. She lay down, pulling the covers up to her chin, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Minutes passed, then hours. The house was silent, but her nerves were on edge. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the wind outside made her jump. Then, just as her eyelids began to grow heavy, there was a sound. Knock, knock. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. The knock came again, louder this time. She sat up, staring at the window across the room, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The sound was unmistakable, a knock on the window. But it was impossible. No one could be outside. She climbed out of bed, her feet moving as if against her will. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the window, her hand reaching out to pull the curtain aside. Her heart raced, her mind screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't. She needed to know. With trembling fingers, she pulled the curtain back, and the window was empty. Nothing but the dark night sky and the distant silhouette of trees swaying in the wind. She let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But as she turned away, her eyes caught sight of something, another note, this time taped to the inside of the window. The note taped to the window fluttered slightly in the breeze as the girl stared at it, her heart racing. The handwriting was the same, elegant and precise, as if whoever had written it was meticulous with every stroke of the pen. Her hands shook as she peeled it away from the glass, unfolding the paper with trepidation. The truth is closer than you think. A chill ran down her spine as she read the words. The truth. What truth? The notes were becoming more ominous, and now they felt like a taunt. Whoever was leaving them clearly knew more than they should, and was playing a twisted game. She rushed to her desk, pulling out the drawer where she had hidden the previous notes. Laying them out side by side, she studied them closely. The handwriting was identical in each, but there was nothing more she could discern from them. No hidden clues, no signatures. Just these cryptic, unnerving messages. The girl bit her lip, frustration and fear mingling inside her. The first note had predicted she would forget her book. The second note had said she would hear a knock. Both had come true. And now, this new note about the truth. The next morning, she decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She needed to talk to someone, anyone, who might help her make sense of this. Over breakfast, she watched the maid carefully as she moved around the kitchen, preparing tea with the same quiet efficiency she always did. "Have you noticed anything strange happening in the house lately?" the girl asked cautiously. The maid paused, her back to the girl, before turning around slowly, a slight frown on her face. "Strange? What do you mean?" The girl hesitated. Should she tell her about the notes? Something in the maid's tone made her pause. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "Just sounds. Sometimes it feels like things move on their own," the girl said, choosing her words carefully. The maid's expression didn't change. "Houses like this often have a life of their own," she said calmly, though her eyes held something the girl couldn't quite decipher. But nothing out of the ordinary. The answer felt too neat, too rehearsed. The girl pushed back her chair and stood, feeling a surge of frustration. "Are you sure? There's nothing you've seen or heard? No one else coming into the house?" The maid smiled faintly. "No one comes here but you and me, dear." The girl's fingers tightened around her cup. She wasn't sure why, but she didn't believe her. The maid was hiding something, and the girl was going to find out what. She excused herself from breakfast and headed back to her room, her mind racing with possibilities. That afternoon, she began searching the house. There were so many rooms, so many dusty, forgotten corners she had never explored. Maybe there was something hidden here, some clue that would help her figure out what was happening. Hours passed as she wandered the winding halls, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. She opened old cabinets, sifted through abandoned boxes, and checked behind faded portraits. The house was full of history, but nothing gave her the answers she sought, until she found the diary. The diary was small, bound in cracked leather, and hidden away in the back of a forgotten cabinet. It was buried beneath old linens, the kind of thing that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, dust rising in the air as she opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was neat, though faded with age. The first entry was dated almost 50 years earlier. She flipped through the pages, her curiosity piqued as she skimmed through the early entries. Mundane details about the daily life of the house's previous occupants. Then, one entry caught her eye. The notes are back. I found one under my pillow again this morning. It said I would fall in the garden today. And I did. The girl's heart raced as she read the words. Notes. This had happened before. 50 years ago, someone else in this house had been receiving the same kind of notes she was finding now. She flipped through the diary frantically, looking for more. They know too much. They always know too much. I try to ignore them, but it's like they're watching me. I can't escape the notes. Every time I try to leave, something happens that stops me. I'm trapped. The words blurred on the page as the girl's panic grew. Whoever had written this had been going through the exact same thing, and they had never escaped. The diary ended abruptly, with no explanation of what had happened to the writer. The last few pages were torn out, leaving only the jagged edges behind. The girl dropped the diary on the floor, her mind racing. The notes weren't a new phenomenon. This had been happening for decades, maybe longer. But why? And who, or what, was behind it? That night, she tried once again to stay awake. She needed to catch whoever was leaving the notes. But no matter how hard she fought it, sleep eventually pulled her under. She woke the next morning, groggy and disoriented, the familiar weight of dread settling in her chest. Slowly, she turned toward her pillow. There it was, another note. Her heart sank as she picked it up, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. You can't stop me. Her breath caught in her throat. This was different. It wasn't a prediction. It was a challenge. Whoever, or whatever, was leaving these notes knew she was trying to stop them, and they were taunting her for it. Desperation clawed at her as she looked around the room. She needed to do something, anything, to regain control. But what? How could she fight against something she didn't even understand? The next day, she confronted the maid again, more direct this time. Who else has lived in this house? Have you ever found anything strange here? Notes, diaries, anything? The maid's face remained calm, but her eyes flickered with something the girl couldn't place. This house has a long history, she replied, her voice steady. But I've never seen anything like what you're describing. The girl clenched her fists. She didn't believe her. The maid was hiding something. She was sure of it now. But what? And why? That night, as the house grew quiet once again, the girl lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting for another sign, another knock, another note. Sleep felt impossible, her mind too restless with fear and suspicion. But despite her best efforts, sleep claimed her once again. And when she woke, the note was waiting for her. The following morning, the girl sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the latest note. It was as though it mocked her with its simplicity, its certainty. You can't stop me. The words were etched into her mind, a constant reminder of the game she seemed trapped in. She had thought that finding the diary would offer her some control, some answers, but it had only deepened the mystery. Now, she felt more powerless than ever. Her routine began to feel like a trap. Each day unfolded as if by someone else's design. When she left her room that morning, she caught the maid's quiet gaze, but their interactions had become strained, full of unspoken questions. The girl was desperate to break free from her predictions, but it seemed the more she tried, the tighter the grip of the notes became. The next note appeared as expected, predictably under her pillow. She unfolded it with trembling hands. You will drop your mother's favorite vase. Her stomach churned. The vase had been in the family for generations, an heirloom passed down, revered by her absent mother. The thought of breaking it made her heart race with anxiety. But what disturbed her more was the accuracy of the predictions. They didn't just suggest events. They seemed to make them happen. Determined to prove the note wrong, she spent the day avoiding the vase entirely. She kept her distance, not even looking in its direction when she passed by the sitting room where it stood proudly on a pedestal. But as the day wore on, her anxiety grew. It gnawed at her, like an itch she couldn't scratch. What if she wasn't in control? What if no matter what she did, the note's prediction would come true? Late in the afternoon, she found herself in the sitting room, drawn to the vase despite herself. She stood before it, her breath shallow, heart pounding in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, but something held her in place. And then it happened. Without thinking, her hand brushed the edge of the pedestal as she turned to leave. The vase wobbled, just for a moment, and then, as if in slow motion, it toppled over, shattering into 1,000 pieces on the hardwood floor. The girl stood frozen, her mind reeling. It had happened, just as the note had said. She had tried to prevent it, but it had happened anyway. Her hands trembled as she dropped to her knees, gathering the sharp, glittering shards in her hands. Tears welled up in her eyes. She had lost control completely. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind. How had it happened? She had been so careful. Was the note responsible, or was she? The questions kept her awake long into the night. The next morning, another note awaited her. The note that greeted her the next morning was simple, almost mundane compared to the others. Look under the floorboards. She frowned. The floorboards? What could that possibly mean? Her room had thick, old wooden floors, the kind that creaked when she walked across them. She sat on her bed, staring down at the note, the words playing over and over in her mind. Her eyes shifted to the floor beneath her feet. Was there something hidden? Something the notes were leading her to find? Determined to uncover whatever secret lay beneath, she knelt beside her bed and began tapping along the floorboards, listening for any hollow sounds. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The boards were solid and unmoving, just as they had always been. But then, near the corner of the room, one of the boards gave a slight creak, different from the others. Her pulse quickened as she dug her fingernails into the groove, prying it up. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the board, revealing a small, dust-covered compartment underneath. Inside, something glimmered faintly in the dim light. Reaching in, she pulled out a thin stack of papers, brittle with age. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was holding. It was the missing pages from the diary. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first page, her eyes scanning the faded words. The writing was the same as the diary entries, though shakier, as though the writer had been in a state of panic. I've tried everything, but the notes won't stop. They know my every move. I can't escape. No matter where I go, they follow me. It's like the house itself is alive, watching, waiting. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. The diary's author had experienced the same relentless torment, the same feelings of helplessness. She flipped to the next page, her eyes devouring the words. The maid knows something. I'm sure of it. She pretends she doesn't, but I've seen her watching me, as if she's waiting for something. I think she's part of it. She has to be. The girl's blood ran cold. The maid. Could it be true? She had suspected the maid, but now it seemed there was evidence to support her fears. She felt a wave of dread wash over her as she continued reading. There's only one way out. I have to confront it. I have to face whatever it is that's controlling this house, or I'll never be free. The final page ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted before they could finish their thought. The girl stared at the words, her mind reeling. Confront it. Face whatever was controlling the house. What did that mean? She sat back on her heels, the weight of the discovery pressing down on her. The notes, the diary, the maid. It was all connected. But how? And what was the house hiding that had caused so much fear and desperation in the previous occupant? The rest of the day passed in a blur as the girl tried to piece together the mystery. She couldn't shake the feeling that the maid was involved, just as the diary had suggested. But the maid had been with her family for years, trusted, and reliable. Could she really be part of this sinister game? That evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet once more, the girl lay in bed, the hidden pages of the diary tucked safely under her pillow. She felt more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The house held secrets, and she was going to find them. As sleep began to pull her under, a single thought echoed in her mind. I have to confront it. The house felt different now. The girl couldn't quite explain it, but ever since discovering the hidden pages of the diary, an eerie presence seemed to cling to the air around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind through the windows felt purposeful, as if the house itself were alive, watching her, waiting for her next move. She had spent the morning pacing her room, her mind racing with thoughts of the diary and the missing pages. The words haunted her, especially the writer's certainty that the maid was involved. Could it really be true? The girl had always felt a strange distance between herself and the maid, but the idea that she could be part of something darker seemed impossible. And yet, the evidence was there, right in the diary. As the afternoon wore on, the girl decided to explore the mansion once again, this time with a specific purpose. She had to understand more about the house, about its history. Perhaps there were other clues hidden away, like the missing pages, that would help her piece together the mystery. The mansion was vast, its many rooms filled with forgotten relics of a bygone era. She wandered through the darkened corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath her. Dust clung to the air as she opened old doors and peered into rooms that hadn't been touched in years. It was in the attic that she found something new. The attic had always been a place of curiosity for the girl, filled with old trunks, faded photographs, and antique furniture covered in dust sheets. It was a space that had always seemed disconnected from the rest of the house. But now, as she pushed open the creaking door, a strange sensation washed over her, a feeling of being watched. She moved cautiously through the cluttered space, her eyes scanning the room for anything unusual. And then she saw it, a single, large trunk pushed into the farthest corner of the attic, its lid slightly ajar. Her heart pounded as she approached it, the air around her growing colder with each step. When she reached the trunk, she knelt down and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, she found a collection of old letters, their paper yellowed with age. She pulled one out, carefully unfolding it. The handwriting was familiar, elegant and precise, just like the notes she had been receiving. The letter was addressed to one of the mansion's former owners, a woman named Eleanor. As the girl read the letter, her breath caught in her throat. It spoke of strange occurrences in the house, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. It seemed Eleanor had experienced the same things the girl was going through now. But what struck the girl most was the final line of the letter. The house is alive, and it knows your every thought. A chill ran down her spine as she read the words. The house, alive? Could be possible. She thought back to the diary, to the notes. Everything seemed to be pointing to the same conclusion. The house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was something else, something sentient. Shivering, the girl stuffed the letters back into the trunk and closed the lid. She needed to leave the attic. The oppressive feeling of being watched was too much to bear. But as she turned to go, she froze. Standing in the doorway was the maid, her eyes fixed on the girl, her expression unreadable. The girl's breath hitched as she stared at the maid, her heart pounding in her chest. How long had she been standing there? And why? The air between them felt thick with tension, as if 1,000 unspoken words hung in the space. The maid didn't move. She just stood there, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching the girl with that same calm expression she always wore. But now, it felt different, like a mask hiding something much darker. "What are you doing here?" the girl asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I could ask you the same," the maid replied smoothly, her tone measured and composed. "The attic isn't a place for wandering, my dear." The girl swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "I was just looking for something." The maid's gaze flickered briefly to the trunk, then back to the girl. "And did you find what you were looking for?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The girl hesitated. Should she tell the maid about the letters? About the diary? Part of her wanted to trust the woman who had cared for her for so long. But another part of her, the part that remembered the warnings in the diary, told her to be careful. I don't know, the girl said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The maid's expression softened slightly, but there was still something unsettling in her eyes. You shouldn't be up here, dear. The attic is full of things best left forgotten. The girl bristled at the maid's words. Why? What are you hiding? The maid's eyes widened, just for a moment, before her calm mask returned. Hiding? I'm not hiding anything, child. But this house, it has a way of holding onto the past. Some things are better left undisturbed. The girl narrowed her eyes. Like the notes. The maid's lips pressed into a thin line. What notes? You know what notes, the girl snapped, frustration bubbling up inside her. The ones that keep showing up under my pillow. The ones that predict everything I do. You must know something about them. The maid's expression remained unreadable. I don't know what you're talking about. You're lying, the girl shouted, her voice echoing in the small attic space. I found the diary. I know what's been happening in this house. You can't keep pretending you don't know. For a long moment, the maid said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick and tense. Then, finally, the maid spoke, her voice low and quiet. This house is older than you know, she said. It has secrets that go back long before you were born. Secrets that can't be easily explained. But I've been here long enough to know one thing. Those who dig too deeply often find things they wish they had. The girl's blood ran cold. What do you mean? The maid's gaze was steady, unwavering. The house watches. It knows. And it doesn't like being disturbed. The girl took a step back, her mind racing. The maid wasn't denying it anymore. She knew. She knew about the house, about the notes, about everything. But what was she hiding? And why wouldn't she tell the truth? I'm not going to stop, the girl said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. I'm going to find out what's happening here, whether you help me or not. The maid's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes now. Be careful, dear, she said quietly. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back. With that, the maid turned and left the attic, leaving the girl standing alone in the dim light, her mind swirling with fear and determination. As the girl made her way back to her room, her thoughts were a whirlwind of questions. The maid had all but confirmed what she had suspected. The house was alive, and something in it was watching her. But why? And what did it want? She didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. The days that followed were a blur of tension and dread. The girl no longer felt safe in her own home. Every corner of the mansion seemed to hold a shadow. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper, and every gust of wind against the windows sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching her. The notes continued to appear, always under her pillow, always predicting events that would come true in the strangest and most unsettling ways. It was as if the house itself was orchestrating her every move, guiding her through a series of events she had no control over. She kept replaying her conversation with the maid in her head. The woman had been so cryptic, so calm, even as she hinted at the dark forces at work in the house. But the girl wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't. She had to know the truth, no matter what it cost her. That night, as she lay in bed, another note appeared beneath her pillow. This time, it was different. The handwriting was more jagged, the letters uneven, as if whoever had written it had done so in a hurry. Tonight, you will see them. Her breath caught in her throat. Them. Who were they? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She read the note over and over, hoping to find some hidden meaning in the words, but there was nothing. Just the ominous promise of something she didn't fully understand. As the night deepened and the shadows in her room grew longer, the girl tried to calm her racing heart. She had to be prepared for whatever was coming, but how could she prepare for something she couldn't see? Something that had been manipulating her life from the shadows for so long? The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching out like an eternity. She lay awake, her eyes fixed on the window, waiting. Waiting for the knock, the sound, the movement, whatever they were. She knew they were coming. And then, just past midnight, she heard it. A soft whisper, so faint she almost missed it. But it was there, drifting through the still air like the ghost of a breath. Her heart leaped into her throat as she sat up, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, but the words were impossible to make out. It sounded like a conversation, hushed voices exchanging secrets just beyond her understanding. She slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor as she moved toward the window. The whispering was coming from outside, beyond the glass. She peered through the curtains, her breath fogging up the window as her eyes searched the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty garden, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, she saw them, figures barely visible in the moonlight, standing in the garden. They were motionless, their faces obscured by the shadows. She couldn't make out any details, but there was something unmistakably human about their shapes. And they were watching her. Her blood ran cold. She stumbled back from the window, her heart racing. She could still hear the whispers, growing louder now, almost as if they were inside her head. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding her, filling the room with their eerie presence. She didn't know what to do. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, but her legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The figures in the garden didn't move, but she could feel their eyes on her, watching her every move, waiting for something. Just as the fear threatened to overwhelm her, the whispering stopped. The figures vanished, dissolving into the night as if they had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. The girl collapsed onto her bed, her body trembling with fear. She had seen them, just like the note had said. But who were they? And what did they want? She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that the house wasn't just watching her anymore. It was communicating with her, manipulating her, pushing her closer and closer to something she couldn't yet understand. The next morning, the girl awoke with a sense of dread she couldn't shake. The events of the previous night felt like a nightmare, but the fear still lingered in her chest, heavy and suffocating. She couldn't forget the figures in the garden, the whispers that had filled the air, the way they had watched her from the darkness. She had to know more. She had to find out what the house wanted, what was trying to tell her. That day, she ventured deeper into the mansion, determined to uncover whatever secrets were hidden within its walls. She started with the library, a vast room filled with dusty old books and forgotten memories. The shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with volumes that hadn't been touched in years. As she searched through the books, her fingers brushed against a worn leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of larger volumes. She pulled it out, her pulse quickening as she realized what she was holding, another piece of the puzzle. The journal belonged to Eleanor, the same woman from the letters she had found in the attic. The entries were dated decades ago, but as the girl flipped through the pages, she realized that Eleanor had experienced the same strange events that were happening now. The house is alive. I can feel it watching me, guiding me. The notes appear every night, just like before. But now something has changed. I think it wants something from me. The girl's heart raced as she read the words. Eleanor had known the truth all along, just like the girl had suspected. The house was alive, and it was controlling everything. But what did it want? What was its purpose? As she continued reading, the journal took a darker turn. I've seen them. The figures in the garden. They watch me every night, just as they've always watched. I tried to ignore them, but now they're inside. They're everywhere. They whisper to me in my sleep, telling me things I don't want to hear. I'm not alone in this house. I never was. The girl's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor had seen the same figures, the same whispers, the same haunting presence that now filled the girl's life. But Eleanor's journal didn't stop there. I figured out, the house doesn't just want to watch. It wants to control. It's feeding on us, using us for something we can't understand. I'm afraid it's too late for me, But whoever finds this journal, beware. The house won't let you go." The girl's hands trembled as she closed the journal. It was all true. Everything she had feared, everything she had tried to ignore, it was real. The house was alive, and it had been controlling her, just as it had controlled Eleanor. But there was more, something darker. The house wasn't just watching her, it was feeding off her, using her for some unknown purpose. And if Eleanor was right, there was no escape. The girl sat back, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She had to do something. She couldn't let the house win. But how could she fight something so powerful, something that had been manipulating her from the moment she set foot in this place? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows of the house. She had to face it, even if it meant putting everything on the line. That night, as she lay in bed, she waited for the whispers to return. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The following night, the air in the house felt heavier than ever, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the girl. She had spent the entire day preparing herself for what was to come. After reading Eleanor's journal, she knew that the house wasn't just alive. It was an entity, something far older and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And tonight, she was going to confront it. The minutes ticked by slowly as the girl lay in her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through her curtains. She had tried to sleep, but her mind was too restless, too consumed by thoughts of what might happen when the entity finally revealed itself. Just as she had expected, the whispering began again. It started softly, barely more than a rustle of leaves in the wind. But as the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with their eerie presence. The girl sat up, her eyes wide open, her breath shallow. She was ready this time. She wasn't going to hide from the entity anymore. "Show yourself," she whispered into the darkness, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know you're here. I know you've been watching me." For a moment, the room was silent. The whispers stopped, as if the house itself was listening. Then, slowly, the temperature in the room began to drop. The air grew colder, the hairs on the back of the girl's neck standing on end. She could feel it now. Something was there, lurking just beyond her sight. "I'm not afraid of you," the girl said, though her heart was racing in her chest. "What do you want from me?" At first, there was no response. But then, from the shadows, a figure began to emerge. It was faint at first, barely more than a wisp of smoke, but as it drew closer, it became more solid, more real. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the figure took shape. A tall, dark form with no distinct features, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The girl forced herself to stay still, her eyes locked on the entity as it hovered in the middle of her room. She could feel its power, its malevolent energy pulsing through the air. "You've been watching me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why? What do you want?" For a long moment, the entity said nothing. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You are mine." The words sent a chill down the girl's spine, but she held her ground. "I'm not yours," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not part of this." The entity's form shifted slightly, as if it were considering her words. Then, it spoke again, its voice low and menacing. "You are in my house. You belong to me." The girl swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you want?" she repeated, her voice more forceful this time. The entity seemed to pause for a moment before answering. "I want what I have always wanted. To control. To feed." The girl's stomach churned at the words. Feed. Was that what had happened to Eleanor? Had the house fed on her, used her for some dark purpose? She felt a surge of anger rise inside her. She wasn't going to let that happen to her. "I won't let you control me," the girl said, her voice shaking but determined. "I won't let you use me." The entity's form darkened, its presence growing more oppressive. The air in the room seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. "You cannot escape." The girl clenched her fists, her mind racing. She had to do something, but what? How could she fight something so powerful, so ancient? Then, she remembered the diary. Eleanor had said there was only one way out. To confront the entity, to face it head-on. And that's what she was going to do. Summoning all her courage, the girl stood up from her bed, her eyes fixed on the dark figure before her. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady now. "You don't own me. This is my life, not yours." The entity didn't respond, but she could feel its anger growing, swirling around her like a storm. She didn't know how much longer she could hold her ground, but she wasn't going to back down. Not now. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice strong and clear. "You can't control me anymore." For a moment, the entity seemed to hesitate. The darkness around it flickered, and the oppressive energy in the room wavered. But then, with a final, echoing whisper, the entity spoke again. "You will see." And just like that, it was gone. The room fell silent, the temperature returning to normal. The girl collapsed onto her bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had faced the entity, and she was still standing. But what had it meant by those final words? "You will see." What was coming next? The girl woke the next morning feeling more determined than ever. The entity's words still echoed in her mind, but she refused to let them shake her resolve. She had faced the darkness and survived. Now, she had to take the next step. She had to find a way to end this once and for all. She spent the day going through the diary and the letters she had found, looking for any clues that could help her defeat the entity. Eleanor had written about confronting the entity, but she hadn't said how. It was as if she had been on the verge of discovering something important, but the house had silenced her before she could share it. The girl knew she couldn't let that happen to her. She had to outsmart the house, outsmart the entity. But how? It wasn't until she returned to the attic that evening that she found the answer. The attic was just as cold and musty as it had been the last time she had visited, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She knew what she was looking for. She made her way to the trunk in the far corner of the room, the one that had held Eleanor's letters. Kneeling down beside it, she pried the lid open and began searching through the papers inside. There had to be something she had missed, some clue that would tell her how to end this. And then she found it. At the bottom of the trunk, hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers, was a small leather-bound book. It was different from the other journals she had found, older, more worn. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. The book was filled with notes, scribbled in haste, as if the writer had been in a desperate hurry. The girl's pulse quickened as she realized what she was reading. It was a record of the house's past, a history of the entity, of the people who had lived there, and of the terrible things that had happened to them. "The house feeds on fear," one passage read. "It grows stronger with every soul it consumes. But there is a way to weaken it, a way to break its hold." The girl's heart raced as she read the words. This was it, the key to defeating the entity. She kept reading, her eyes scanning the pages for the solution. The house cannot be destroyed, but its power can be severed. To break the connection, one must confront the entity and refuse its control. Only then will its hold be weakened. Only then will you be free. The girl sat back, her mind racing. It was just like Eleanor had said. She had to confront the entity, refuse its control. But the words in the book gave her hope. It was possible to break the connection. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. She spent the rest of the evening planning her next move. She would confront the entity again, just like she had the night before. But this time, she would be prepared. She would refuse its control, and she wouldn't back down. She was going to break the connection once and for all. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt a strange sense of calm. The entity would come again. She was sure of it. But this time, she was ready. As the clock struck midnight, the whispering began. As midnight approached, the girl lay in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had read the instructions over and over, preparing herself for what was to come. The book had been clear. She needed to confront the entity and refuse its control. But knowing what she had to do didn't make the fear any easier to bear. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the oppressive energy filling the air like a heavy fog. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of her plan. She wasn't going to let the entity win. She was going to break free. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on her bedside table. The minutes seemed to drag by, each one bringing her closer to the moment she had been dreading. And then, as the clock struck 12, the whispering began. It started just as it had the night before, soft at first, barely noticeable. But it grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with its eerie presence. The girl sat up, her eyes scanning the darkness. She knew the entity was there, waiting. She spoke into the darkness, her voice steady but firm. "I know you're here. Show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing. The whispering continued, but the entity remained hidden in the shadows. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "Show yourself," she demanded, louder this time. The whispering stopped, and the room fell silent. The air grew cold, and the girl could feel the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on her. Slowly, the dark figure began to take shape in front of her, just as it had the night before. But this time, it felt different, stronger, more malevolent. The entity hovered before her, its form shifting and pulsing with dark energy. She could feel its anger, its desire to control her, to feed on her fear. But she was ready. "You don't control me," the girl said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you." The entity's form darkened, its presence growing more oppressive. The air in the room seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. But the girl stood her ground. She wasn't going to let the entity scare her. "Not this time. You can't control me anymore," she said, her voice rising. "I won't let you." The entity shifted, its dark form swirling around her like a storm. She could feel its power pressing against her, trying to break her resolve. But she refused to give in. She had come too far to back down now. "Let me go," she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. "I'm not yours." The entity seemed to hesitate, its form flickering for a moment as if it were unsure of what to do. But then, with a surge of dark energy, it lashed out, sending a wave of cold, oppressive force toward the girl. She stumbled back, the force of the attack nearly knocking her off her feet. But she held firm, clenching her fists and refusing to let the entity win. "I won't be controlled," she shouted, her voice filled with defiance. "You don't own me." For a moment, the entity seemed to waver, its form flickering again as if it were losing strength. The air in the room began to shift, and the oppressive energy that had filled the space started to lift. The girl could feel it. The connection was weakening. Summoning all her strength, she took a step forward, her eyes locked on the dark figure before her. "You don't control me," she repeated, her voice steady and strong. "You never did." With those final words, the entity's form flickered one last time before it began to dissolve, its dark energy dissipating into the air. The oppressive weight that had hung over the house lifted, and the room was filled with a sudden, eerie silence. The girl stood in the middle of her room, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had broken the entity's hold. But the victory felt bittersweet. The house was still standing, and she knew that the darkness would always be a part of it. But for now, she was free. As the oppressive force of the entity faded, the girl sank onto her bed, her body heavy with the toll of the confrontation. The cold air in the room began to warm, and for the first time in days, she could breathe freely. The house no longer felt like a predator lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. She had faced it down, and she had won. But something still nagged at her, a gnawing doubt that refused to let go. The final words of the entity echoed in her mind. "You will see." What had it meant? What was left for her to discover? She sat in silence for a long time, staring at the walls of her room. The house felt different now, quieter, but not entirely at peace. The darkness wasn't gone. It had retreated, but it was still there, lingering in the corners, waiting. As she sat there, the realization slowly dawned on her. The entity hadn't been lying when it said she belonged to the house. No matter what she did, no matter how much she fought, the house would always hold a part of her. She had broken connection for now, but it wasn't permanent. The house would call her back, just as it had called back those before her. The girl's heart sank. She had fought so hard to break free, to escape the entity's control. But now, she realized that freedom had come at a price. She could leave the house, but she would never truly be free of it. She thought of Eleanor, of the people who had lived in the house before her. They had all tried to escape, to break the house's hold on them, but none of them had succeeded. And now, it was her turn to pay the price. The realization hit her like a wave, and tears filled her eyes. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. She was still trapped, still tied to the house. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the house would always be a part of her. She wiped the tears from her eyes, forcing herself to stand. She wasn't going to give in to despair. She had faced down the entity, and she had survived. That was something. But the next step was clear. She couldn't stay here. The house would never let her go completely, but she had to try. She had to leave before it could pull her back in. The girl gathered her things, her hands trembling as she packed a small bag. She didn't need much, just enough to get her out of the house, away from the darkness that still lingered within its walls. As she walked through the halls of the mansion one last time, she felt a strange sense of finality. She had lived in this house her entire life, but now it felt like a stranger to her. The walls, the floors, the furniture, they all seemed foreign, as if the house had changed in the night. She paused at the front door, her hand resting on the doorknob. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway behind her. The house was silent, but she could feel its presence, watching her, waiting. With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped outside. The cold night air hit her face, and for a moment, she stood there, letting the wind wash over her. The world outside felt vast, open, and full of possibilities. But as she took her first steps away from the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, waiting for her to return. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't coming back. As she walked down the long, winding path that led away from the house, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had escaped, at least for now, but the house's final words still echoed in her mind, a warning she couldn't ignore: "You will see." She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. Whatever the house had planned, whatever darkness still lurked within its walls, she wouldn't let it control her. She had made her sacrifice, and she had paid the price. Now, it was time to move on, but deep down, she knew the house wasn't done with her yet. The days that followed were strange, as if the world outside the mansion wasn't quite real. The girl had left the house behind, but the weight of its presence still clung to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. She found herself wandering aimlessly through the nearby town, unsure of where to go or what to do. For the first time in her life, she was free, or at least that's what she told herself. But every step away from the house felt wrong, like something was pulling her back. She couldn't forget the final words of the entity, the ominous warning it had whispered before vanishing: "You will see." She tried to push the thought out of her mind, focusing on the future instead. She had escaped the house, hadn't she? She had broken the connection, faced the entity, and survived. That was what mattered. But no matter how hard she tried, the house still haunted her thoughts, lingering in the back of her mind like a dark cloud. After several restless nights in the small inn where she had taken refuge, the girl decided to take one last walk through the town before leaving for good. She didn't know where she was going, but she needed to get as far away from the mansion as possible. As she walked through the quiet streets, the wind picked up, swirling fallen leaves around her feet. The air was cold, but she barely felt it. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few days, the confrontation with the entity, the revelation of the house's dark history. She stopped by a small park, its benches empty and the trees bare. She sat down, staring at the empty playground in front of her. The world felt so normal here, so distant from the nightmare she had left behind. But even in this peaceful setting, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. That's when she noticed the small piece of paper on the ground, half buried under a pile of leaves. Her heart skipped a beat as she bent down to pick it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. It was a note. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words, written in the same familiar, elegant handwriting. "You will return." The world around her seemed to blur, the noise of the town fading into the background as the weight of the words settled over her. The house hadn't let her go. It never had. She could leave, but she would always be connected to it. The entity's words echoed in her mind. "You are mine." The girl crumpled the note in her hand, her heart racing. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. But the house wasn't giving her a choice. It had always been there, watching her, guiding her, controlling her. And now, it was calling her back. She stood up, the note still clenched in her fist, and started walking. Her legs felt heavy, each step taking more effort than the last. She tried to fight it, to push the thoughts out of her mind, but it was no use. The house had its hooks in her, and no matter how far she ran, she would never escape. As she walked through the streets, her mind raced with possibilities. Was it all in her head? Was the house really still controlling her? Or was she just imagining it? But deep down, she knew the truth. The house had always been more than just a place. It was alive, and its power over her was far from broken. By the time she reached the edge of town, her body was trembling with fear and exhaustion. She couldn't go back, but she couldn't stay here either. The house had won. It always won. The wind howled around her, whipping her hair into her face as she stood at the crossroads, unsure of which path to take. But as she stood there, a sense of calm washed over her. The house would always be with her, no matter where she went. She couldn't fight it, but she didn't have to live in fear of it either. With a deep breath, she let the crumpled note fall from her hand, watching as the wind carried it away. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it. The house might call her back, but for now, she was free. As she turned to leave, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The house's grip on her wasn't gone, but it was weaker. She had faced the darkness, survived the entity, and learned the truth. And now, she was moving on. But as she walked away, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see the mansion looming in the distance. It wasn't there, of course, but the feeling remained. The house would always be a part of her. It would always watch, always wait. But for now, she had won. And that was enough. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling content like this. I'd love to know what moment in the story impacted you the most. Drop it in the comments below. Also, I want to hear from you. What kind of stories would you like to see on the channel next? Whether it's mystery, suspense, or something completely different, leave your suggestions down below. And who knows, your idea could be the inspiration for the next story. Thanks for being part of this journey, and I can't wait to create more unforgettable stories with you.